When I woke up that night, I never imagined I would end up in the emergency room, trembling with terror and clutching my swollen belly. My husband, the man I promised forever to, had just hit me. And the fear I felt wasn't just for me. It was for our baby, moving quietly inside me, utterly innocent. I can still remember the sharp sting across my arm, the way my skin burned, the room spinning around me. The kitchen smelled faintly of burnt toast, cold coffee on the counter, and something metallic I couldn't place at first. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it would burst before I could even call for help. Earlier that evening, everything had seemed almost normal. He had smiled at me over dinner, his hand brushing against mine, whispering something about how excited he was for our baby. I had smiled back, foolishly hoping that maybe this time it was just words, not a warning. But something had shifted over the past weeks. Small, almost invisible cracks in the way he looked at me, the slight tension when I asked about work, the way his jaw tightened at the mention of our growing family. I didn't want to admit it, not even to myself, but the warning signs were there. The nights when he slammed doors or shouted at shadows, the subtle bruises I made excuses for in front of friends, bruises I swore came from clumsy moments in the kitchen or leaning too hard on the counter. I had wanted to believe in the man I married, the father-to-be, the partner I had built dreams with. But the truth is, sometimes love blinds you to danger until it's almost too late. That night, it started with a disagreement about something trivial. I can't even recall exactly what it was. Maybe the dishes, maybe my spending habits, maybe just a spark in him that needed fuel. One moment, we were speaking in hushed tones. The next, his hand was against me. I froze, my mind screaming for escape while my body betrayed me with terror. I could hear my baby's tiny movements, fluttering like wings, and my stomach sank. "Please, not now," I whispered, clutching the counter. But it didn't stop. In the chaos, there was a moment I'll never forget. When he realized I was on the verge of screaming, the same man who had moments ago smiled, laughed, and whispered promises froze. His eyes widened, not with remorse, not with worry, but with a hint of fear. For the first time, I saw him not as a man in control, but as someone who might finally have to face consequences. That split second was all I needed to reach my phone and call 911, my trembling fingers barely managing to press the numbers. The sirens, when they came, were both a relief and a nightmare. Relief because help was near, a lifeline I hadn't dared hope for. Nightmare because I had to admit out loud what had happened. The paramedics moved quickly, their voices calm but firm, their hands gentle as they guided me onto the stretcher. Every bump of the ambulance made me wince, imagining it harming the tiny life I carried. At the hospital, the bright lights were blinding, the antiseptic smell sharp in my nose. Nurses surrounded me, checking my vitals, speaking to me in soft tones meant to calm me, but their eyes held a silent question. How did this happen? I couldn't answer. How do you explain that the person you loved most in the world just turned into someone terrifying? How do you explain that the hand you held in love one day could harm the life you both created the next? While they examined me, I kept thinking of the moments that led to this, the subtle signs I ignored, the way he rolled his eyes at my laughter, how he tightened his grip when holding me, how his smile sometimes didn't reach his eyes. Those moments I told myself, "It's fine, he's stressed," or "he didn't mean it." Those excuses had cost me nearly everything that night. It wasn't just the physical pain I endured, but the emotional collapse, the sudden realization that the home I trusted could be dangerous. I felt betrayed by the person I loved more than myself, and helpless for the tiny life growing inside me. The nurses asked me questions I could barely answer, and I could hear his voice outside the ER doors, frantic, muttering apologies to anyone who would listen. But those words meant nothing. Words without action were empty. As they prepared me for an ultrasound to check on the baby, I held my breath. Every movement on the screen, every tiny heartbeat became a lifeline. I whispered to my unborn child, promising we'd make it through, that we'd survive this together. And somehow, in that sterile, bright room, a flicker of resolve began to form inside me. I realized that while I could not change what happened, I could control what came next. I could protect my child, myself, and demand the respect and safety that every human deserves. My husband had underestimated me, underestimated the power of a mother's love and the strength that comes from facing betrayal head-on. And though the night had been terrifying, the fear, the pain, the almost unthinkable loss had also ignited a fire inside me, a fire that would not be ignored, silenced, or defeated. In the weeks before that night, life had seemed almost ordinary if you looked at it from the outside. I had a routine. Mornings spent making breakfast for my husband, packing my lunches, tidying the house. Afternoons filled with work emails and phone calls to doctors about prenatal appointments. Evenings were quieter, a mix of soft music, dim lights, and small, fleeting conversations about what the baby might be like. On the surface, he was attentive. He'd rub my back after long days, help me with chores, and occasionally bring home little treats, flowers or chocolate, things that used to make me smile. But there were the cracks, subtle at first. A sigh when I mentioned a craving, a sharp glance when I laughed too loudly, an edge to his tone that made me shrink back. I wanted to tell myself it was stress from work, that I was imagining it. But deep down, a small, insistent voice whispered that not everything was as it seemed. I remember one Saturday morning, sitting on the edge of our bed with a mug of tea, watching the sunlight streak across the floorboards. He had come in, smiling, carrying 2 breakfast sandwiches. He handed me mine with a tenderness that seemed rehearsed. "You're glowing today," he said, leaning down to kiss my cheek. The words sounded kind, but there was a tension in his jaw I couldn't ignore. I asked him if he was stressed at work, and he laughed it off, but his fingers drummed impatiently on the counter behind him. Then there were the nights I went to bed alone more often than not. He'd claim he was catching up on emails or needed time for himself. I had grown accustomed to the silence, convincing myself that perhaps this was just how our marriage had shifted in the pregnancy months. And yet, there was that nagging feeling in my chest, the one that made my hams sweat when he came home late, the one that made me check the locks on our doors twice before falling asleep. Small, strange things began to pile up. His phone, which used to sit openly on the kitchen table, was now constantly in his pocket, buzzing with notifications he would quickly hide. I noticed him deleting messages, muttering excuses about spam or work contacts. Sometimes, when he thought I wasn't looking, I caught him staring at me strangely, almost calculatingly, before smiling and speaking as if nothing had happened. I didn't want to believe that this man, who had professed love, promised to protect me, could be hiding a darkness so profound. But the gut instinct, a mother's intuition perhaps, was hard to ignore. It whispered that danger might be closer than I dared to imagine. One evening, he came home unusually quiet. The air smelled faintly of smoke, though there was no fire. His eyes darted nervously when I asked him about his day. I noticed his hands were shaking slightly as he placed his briefcase on the table. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. That night, I lay awake in bed, listening to his breathing. I wanted to think that it was just nerves, or perhaps the stress of preparing for the baby. But there was an undercurrent, a tension in the room, like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. I started paying closer attention.
noticing patterns I had overlooked before. How he flinched when I reached for his phone, how his tone shifted when I asked simple questions, how his laughter sometimes seemed forced. It all added up in a slow, quiet way, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I remember thinking, I need to trust my instincts. I can't let this go. But at the same time, I wrestled with denial. I loved him, or at least the man I thought he was. Could I really be seeing the truth? And then came the first real warning sign. It was a Friday night, a quiet evening at home. I had just finished putting away dishes, and he came into the kitchen holding a glass of water. His eyes were dark, unreadable. He said nothing at first, just stared at me as I wiped my hands on a towel. Then, in a voice so low I almost didn't hear it, he muttered something about how careless I was, how I needed to pay more attention to everything: my health, our baby, our home. The words themselves were harsh, but bearable. It was the look in his eyes, the calculation, the anger barely restrained, that made my stomach twist into knots. I tried to laugh it off, said, "It's okay, I'll be careful." But inside, my heart was hammering. That night, I slept fitfully, every sound in the house amplified: the ticking clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump. I knew, even if I couldn't yet admit it fully, that something was wrong. In the following days, his temper grew more unpredictable. Small disagreements became shouting matches. Little mistakes I made, spilling tea, misplacing a towel, were met with sharp words, sudden frustration, and sometimes an alarming shove or grasp that made me flinch. I began documenting everything in a notebook: dates, times, incidents, feelings. A quiet, secret archive of our life, just in case. Yet, despite everything, he would switch back to charm and affection as if nothing had happened. He'd smile, bring flowers, whisper apologies, and for a while, I let myself believe it was just stress, just moments of anger anyone might have. But inside, I knew that this oscillation between tenderness and violence was dangerous, and I knew that one day it could escalate beyond anything I could manage. It was during a routine checkup at the doctor's office that the first real shock came. I had gone alone, nervous but determined to ensure the baby was healthy. When the nurse measured my blood pressure, it was unusually high. I shrugged it off, but the doctor's furrowed brow and quiet questions made my stomach drop. "Have you experienced any falls, any physical trauma?" I swallowed hard, realizing that the incidents I had excused, the shoves, the raised voices, the moments of fear, those were not just stress or temporary anger. They were warning signs. I left the clinic feeling hollow, a cold pit of dread settling in my chest. That night, he came home smiling, carrying a bag of groceries, but the warmth in my chest was gone, replaced with vigilance. I began noticing more: the way he flinched when I reached for his phone, how his tone shifted when I asked simple questions, how his laughter sometimes seemed forced. It all added up in a slow, quiet way, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I knew something had to change, but I didn't yet know how. And then came the night that would change everything. A minor disagreement, a spark that became a flare, and suddenly I was on the kitchen floor, clutching my belly, hearing him yell, feeling the sting of his hands, the chaos of love turned violent. The world had shifted in that instant. The ordinary life I had clung to was gone, replaced with a terror that would either break me or awaken a strength I didn't know I had.
The morning after the attack, I woke in a haze of exhaustion and fear. My body ached, my belly throbbed with worry, and my mind was spinning with disbelief. How had it come to this? The man I had married, the man I had trusted with my heart and our baby's life, had shown me a side I couldn't unsee. And yet, in that painful morning light, I realized that the truth had only begun to reveal itself. It started with the phone. I hadn't dared touch it during the fight, and now, alone in the bedroom, my fingers hovered over the screen. Something, intuition or maybe desperation, made me check the messages he had tried so desperately to hide. My hands shook as I scrolled through the threads, at first convinced I might be imagining things, that perhaps I was reading too much into words meant innocuously. But the evidence was undeniable. Messages from women I had never heard of, filled with intimacy, planning, and secrecy. There were photos, receipts for gifts, whispered promises of meetings while I was at work or asleep. And then there it was, the cruelest betrayal of all, a detailed plan he had made to isolate me, to control me, to manipulate my pregnancy and my emotions so completely that I would have nowhere to turn. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. He hadn't just lost his temper that night, he had been preparing for this kind of control, this kind of violence, all along. I remember sitting on the bed, phone trembling in my hand, staring at the screen as tears blurred the words. My baby stirred inside me, tiny kicks that felt like little alarms, reminding me that someone depended on me to act, to protect, to survive. I felt a rage unlike anything I had known. It wasn't the kind of anger that comes from a fleeting argument. It was the deep, fierce, protective fury of a mother who suddenly realized her child's life was at risk. I confronted him later that day. My voice was steady, though my hands shook. I asked, "Who are they?" holding up the phone, letting the evidence speak for itself. He looked at me, wide-eyed, trying to craft an excuse, a lie, a story that would make me believe he wasn't capable of what I had just discovered. But the truth was written in the messages, the photos, the calculated plans. There was no room for doubt. He stuttered, tried to speak, but I had already made a decision in that moment. Nothing would protect him from the consequences. I called my sister, my closest confidant, someone I trusted to help me navigate the next steps. The relief I felt when she arrived was almost physical, a weight lifting from my shoulders. With her by my side, I felt stronger, more grounded. I wasn't alone anymore, and for the first time in months, I felt like I had control over my life again. The discovery didn't stop at the phone. Over the next days, I uncovered other layers of deceit. Hidden bank accounts, emails detailing affairs, small but significant manipulations meant to undermine my confidence, my decisions, my sense of self. Every new revelation hurt, but each one also steeled my resolve. I realized that the man I had loved was not the man I thought I knew, and the realization freed me from the hope that things might return to normal. The emotional weight of the betrayal was crushing. I remember crying in the shower one morning, letting the water wash over me as I whispered apologies to myself, to my baby, for not seeing the signs sooner. But the grief was mingled with clarity. This wasn't my fault. I hadn't caused this, and I had every right to protect myself and my child. That clarity became a compass, guiding my actions as I began to plan the next steps. I decided to document everything. Every message, every photo, every incident of abuse. I made copies, organized them carefully, knowing that one day they would be crucial if I needed to take legal action. At the same time, I started preparing myself emotionally. I had to be strong, composed, and unwavering, because the moment I showed fear again, he would try to regain control, and I could not let that happen. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation that confirmed everything I had feared. He was on a call, speaking in hushed tones, arranging another meeting with one of the women he had been messaging. My stomach dropped, but I forced myself to listen, memorizing every word.
The calculated coldness in his voice was chilling. He wasn't apologetic, he wasn't conflicted, he was planning, plotting, and assuming I would remain oblivious. That night, as I lay in bed, I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of the betrayal. I wept quietly, my hands resting protectively on my stomach. I whispered to my unborn child that I would do whatever it took to keep us safe. And for the first time, I allowed myself a glimmer of hope, not because he had changed, but because I had awakened to my own strength. I confronted him again, this time with evidence laid out before him. I didn't shout, I didn't plead, I simply spoke the truth, letting the weight of facts and morality do what words could not. His face went pale, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Not the fleeting fear of being caught in a lie, but the fear of losing control, of facing justice, of realizing that the power he had wielded over me for so long was gone. In that moment, the dynamic shifted irrevocably. He realized, finally, that his actions had consequences far beyond what he could manipulate or excuse. And though the emotional pain of betrayal was immense, there was a strange sense of liberation in seeing the man who had terrified me shrink back, powerless, in the face of truth.
After the confrontation, I knew I couldn't go back to the way things were. Every moment with him carried a threat, every glance a potential danger. My priority was our baby and myself. I began taking careful steps, small but deliberate, to regain control over my life. It started with boundaries. I told him, calmly but firmly, that I would no longer tolerate violence, manipulation, or secrecy. I made it clear that any further aggression would be met with immediate consequences. But words alone were not enough. I needed protection, structure, and a plan. I called the local domestic violence hotline, spoke with a counselor, and learned about my legal rights. Every piece of advice, every pamphlet, every quiet word of reassurance I received strengthened my resolve. I realized that strength wasn't just physical, it was preparation, knowledge, and unwavering conviction. I also leaned on my family. My sister became my anchor, accompanying me to appointments, listening to my fears, and validating my feelings. I started documenting everything meticulously: incidents, threats, unusual behavior, suspicious messages. The notebook I had started weeks before became a lifeline, a tangible record of my reality. I knew I needed evidence, not just for legal purposes, but as proof to myself that I was doing everything to protect the life I carried. Meanwhile, I watched him closely, not out of obsession, but necessity. Every movement, every conversation, every attempt at charm or apology was noted. I saw the cracks in his facade widen. He realized he could no longer intimidate me, and the frustration simmering in his eyes told me that he knew he had underestimated me. One evening, I took a decisive step. I confronted him again, this time in a more public setting, a family dinner where other relatives were present. I didn't shout, didn't scream, didn't try to humiliate him. I simply laid out the facts, calmly but with conviction. I explained the consequences of his actions, the betrayal, and the abuse. I could see the shock in his face, the first real fear he had shown. He hadn't expected that I would take control, that I would gather evidence, that I would confront him in a way that left no room for manipulation. The next steps were careful but firm. I filed a restraining order, ensuring that I had legal protection in place. I set up security measures at home, not out of paranoia, but as a practical safeguard for my baby and myself. I began attending therapy, both to process the trauma and to reinforce my emotional resilience. Every session was a brick in the foundation I was rebuilding, stronger, firmer, more self-assured. I also had to make difficult choices about communication. I limited contact, insisting on only necessary interactions, preferably in mediated or supervised settings. Every attempt he made to charm or guilt me was met with calm refusal. I realized that protecting myself and my child meant that I had to sever not just physical access, but emotional leverage. In parallel,
I reached out to close friends and allies. I wanted to ensure that there were witnesses, people who could support me and verify my story if needed. I couldn't risk isolation because I had seen how dangerous it was when he assumed control over both space and narrative. Strength, I realized, was not just in confrontation. It was in preparation, community, and unwavering clarity. The nights were the hardest. Sleep was uneasy, filled with flashbacks of that night and the fear of what could have happened. But each morning, I reminded myself of my goals: safety, protection, and justice. I would not allow fear to dictate my actions. I began taking small but empowering steps, preparing healthy meals for myself, speaking openly to my doctor about mental and physical health, exercising lightly to stay strong, and reading to our baby aloud, creating a world of love and security despite the chaos surrounding us. And then came the moment when my efforts bore tangible results. He tried again, subtly, to test my boundaries, using charm, guilt, or veiled threats. But this time, I was ready. I calmly excused myself, documented the interaction, and reported it through proper channels. I could see the confusion and frustration in his eyes. He had expected submission, silence, compliance. Instead, he found strength, calm, and determination. It was in those moments that I realized the true power of measured action. Revenge, in the sense of petty vindictiveness, was not my goal. My goal was protection, empowerment, and justice. Every step I took was designed to secure the safety of our baby, restore my dignity, and make clear that actions have consequences. The tension between us gradually shifted. He no longer had the same control, no longer dictated my emotional or physical responses. The household became a space where I determined the rules, the boundaries, and the safety measures. It was not easy. There were nights of fear, days of stress, and moments of doubt, but the awareness that I was reclaiming my life and protecting a life that depended on me made the struggle meaningful. I remember one evening, sitting quietly in the nursery, with soft light filtering through the curtains. I ran my fingers over the tiny blankets, felt the quiet movements of our baby, and allowed myself a deep breath. The fear was still there, a shadow lurking, but it was accompanied by a new sensation: agency. I was no longer a passive participant in my own life. I had acted, I had set boundaries, I had demanded justice, and I was ready for whatever came next. By the time I went to bed that night, I felt a quiet confidence I hadn't known in months. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but I had learned something crucial. Strength is born from necessity, clarity, and unwavering love, and nothing, not even betrayal or violence, could diminish the resolve of a mother determined to protect her child.
It wasn't long before the truth began to ripple beyond the walls of our home. Once I had gathered the evidence, set boundaries, and documented everything, I knew it was time to make the situation known. Not to humiliate him, but to protect others and ensure accountability. The first step was legal. Filing the reports with authorities was a mixture of relief and tension. I remember sitting across from the officer, my hands folded neatly on the desk, explaining everything with calm precision. I didn't cry, I didn't yell. I simply recounted the facts: the violence, the threats, the abuse, the messages, the manipulation. Every word was supported by evidence, meticulously documented in my notebook and saved on my phone. His reaction, when authorities reached out, was disbelief. He had assumed that I would stay silent, that fear would keep me trapped. But instead of the quiet compliance he expected, he faced scrutiny, formal questioning, and the real possibility of consequences for his actions. The look on his face, panic, shame, confusion, was satisfying. Not in a vindictive sense, but as a validation that truth has a way of demanding accountability. I also had to navigate family and community dynamics. Some relatives were shocked, others skeptical, and a few tried to minimize the events. But I remained steady. I shared the evidence calmly, with clear intention. I let the facts speak. Slowly, people began to understand the severity of the situation. The whispers of doubt faded, replaced with cautious support and recognition that I had acted not out of spite, but out of necessity and care. The hospital staff, too, became witnesses to the story. Nurses and doctors who had seen the injuries and heard my account were firm in their support. Their presence reinforced my position and reminded me that I was not alone. There was a network of people who believed me, who validated my experience, and who helped ensure that my voice carried weight. He tried, of course, to repair his reputation. The charm, the apologies, the claims that I had misunderstood everything. All of it was met with a calm, measured response from me. I refused to be manipulated again. For the first time, I realized that accountability isn't about convincing someone of their wrongdoing. It's about setting boundaries that make further harm impossible. The consequences extended into his social and professional life. Word of his actions spread cautiously but unmistakably. Colleagues who had once admired him began to see cracks in his character. Friends who had accepted his excuses started asking questions. He could no longer control the narrative, no longer suppress the truth, and the fear that had eluded him in private now surfaced in every interaction. There was a moment, several weeks later, when he attempted to speak to me privately in the park, hoping to charm me into silence. I stood firm. I explained that our lives had changed irrevocably, and that his path forward required acknowledgement of wrongdoing and acceptance of consequences. He left without another word, his face pale, the illusion of control completely gone. At home, I felt a new sense of peace. The baby's kicks, once a reminder of fear, now became a source of joy, grounding me in the present and reminding me of what truly mattered. I had reclaimed our home as a safe space. Every corner, every room, every little detail became part of a sanctuary I controlled. No longer was fear the quiet background of our lives. It was replaced by vigilance, preparation, and the comfort of knowing that I had acted decisively. Friends and family rallied around me. My sister, in particular, continued to offer support, accompanying me to appointments, checking in, and helping me process the emotional weight of what had happened. Her presence reminded me that healing is not a solitary act. It requires connection, trust, and a network willing to stand by you while you navigate the aftermath of betrayal. I also began to notice subtle shifts in the community. People who had once overlooked or excused his behavior began to acknowledge it. There was a sense of social justice quietly taking shape, a recognition that violence and betrayal have consequences, even when perpetrated behind closed doors. It wasn't about shame or spectacle. It was about truth and accountability, and the awareness that no one is beyond it. One of the most profound moments came during a prenatal checkup. My doctor smiled warmly as the baby kicked on the monitor, commenting on the healthy heartbeat. I realized that the medical staff, the family, the friends, and even the authorities who had supported me were all part of a network of protection and truth. My baby, the life that I had fought to protect, became the center of my resolve. Every action I took, from documenting the abuse, seeking legal support, confronting him with evidence, and rallying my support network, was ultimately for this child. And in that focus, I found clarity, peace, and a renewed sense of purpose.
The days that followed were quieter in a way I hadn't known for months. There were no sudden outbursts, no lurking tension, no moments of fear that had once shadowed every corner of our home. Instead, there was space. Space to breathe, to heal, and to imagine a future that felt possible again. Healing, I realized, wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a slow, deliberate process, like tending to a garden after a storm. Some days were easier, filled with small joys, the baby kicking in the womb, the warm sunlight spilling through the nursery window, the soft laughter of my sister as we folded tiny clothes together. Other days were harder. Flashbacks, moments of doubt, tears that arrived unbidden. But each moment, whether light or heavy, reminded me that life was moving forward, and I was moving with it.
I began to reclaim parts of myself that I had set aside. I started journaling again, pouring out memories, fears, and hopes onto the page. The act of writing became a form of release, a way to untangle the knots of trauma and lay them down in a space where they could no longer control me. I painted small pictures for the nursery, played soft music for the baby, and allowed myself to dream of a life filled with laughter rather than fear. One evening, I sat in the nursery, running my hands over the tiny blankets that I had arranged, thinking about everything that had happened. I realized how much strength I had gained, not the kind measured by force, but the kind measured by resilience, clarity, and the ability to protect those who depend on you. I had faced betrayal, violence, and fear, and yet I had emerged with a sense of purpose and calm I never thought possible. Therapy played a key role in my recovery. Speaking with a professional helped me process the emotional weight of the abuse and the betrayal. I learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting or excusing. It means understanding, accepting, and finding ways to live fully despite the scars. Each session reinforced my resolve to build a safe, loving environment for my baby and to nurture my own sense of self-worth. Family gatherings, once fraught with tension, began to feel lighter. My sister's laughter, my mother's gentle advice, and the quiet support of friends became sources of comfort. I realized how vital community is in recovery, how having people who believe you, support you, and stand with you can transform fear into courage, pain into purpose. I also began to think about the future. What kind of parent did I want to be? What lessons would I impart to my child? The answer became clear: love, strength, integrity, and the courage to stand up for what is right. I wanted my baby to grow up in a world where honesty, respect, and kindness mattered, and to know from the start that they were protected and cherished. Slowly, life began to regain a rhythm. I returned to small routines I had abandoned: cooking meals, taking walks, enjoying quiet evenings with soft music and warm blankets. Each action was a reclaiming of control, a reminder that my life was mine to shape. And in those routines, I discovered something profound. Joy can coexist with scars, and strength can arise from the deepest valleys of pain. Forgiveness, I learned, was not for him, it was for me. Letting go of the need to carry anger, the constant tension of reliving trauma, allowed me to create space for peace. It did not mean excusing his actions or pretending they never happened. It meant choosing to live fully without allowing his choices to define the rest of my life. I also embraced self-care in ways I had neglected: prenatal yoga, long baths, reading books that nourished my mind, and gentle walks outside became rituals of healing. They reminded me that nurturing oneself is not selfish. It is necessary, especially when nurturing another life depends on it. Through it all, the baby thrived. Each heartbeat, each tiny movement, each prenatal checkup was a reminder that life persists, even after trauma. The presence of this small, innocent life became my anchor, a source of motivation and comfort that reminded me why all the actions I had taken were worth it. One evening, as I sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket and watching the sunset, I felt a sense of gratitude that I had once thought impossible. Gratitude for the people who supported me, for the strength I had discovered within myself, for the lessons that pain had taught me, and above all, gratitude for the tiny life I had protected and the future we would build together, a future grounded in love, safety, and integrity. I knew the journey wasn't over. Healing is never truly complete. It is a continuous process. but I also knew that I had survived, endured, and grown stronger than I had imagined possible. The fear that once dominated my life had been replaced with vigilance, clarity, and an unwavering commitment to protect what mattered most. And in that moment of quiet reflection, I realized that strength, resilience, and love are not abstract concepts. They are choices we make every day, in the small actions, the boundaries we set, and the courage to face reality with honesty and dignity. As I sit here now, weeks later, watching the sun filter softly through the nursery window, I can hardly believe the journey we've been through. The fear, the pain, the betrayal, they were real and they were raw. But so was the love I carried for my baby. And it was that love that gave me the courage to act, to set boundaries, and to reclaim our lives. I've learned something important through all of this. Strength isn't loud. It isn't about shouting, punishing, or seeking revenge. Strength is quiet, patient, and deliberate. It's the calm in the storm, the courage to face the truth, and the ability to protect those who cannot protect themselves. I had to fight, not with anger, but with clarity, preparation, and love. Healing doesn't mean forgetting either. It means acknowledging what happened, learning from it, and choosing to live fully despite the scars. My baby will grow up in a safe, loving environment, and I will continue to honor that by being the best version of myself, resilient, compassionate, and empowered. To anyone listening who has faced betrayal, abuse, or fear, I want you to know this. You are stronger than you think. Seek help. Trust your instincts. Protect yourself and those who depend on you. And remember, justice doesn't always look like punishment. It can look like peace, freedom, and reclaiming your life. Would you have found the courage to act as I did? Could you stand firm in the face of betrayal and fear? Think about it and share your thoughts in the comments below. And if my story has touched you, consider subscribing. There are countless stories like mine, each with lessons that remind us of resilience, love, and the human spirit.